Would you like to be able to stand up in front of a group of people and get your point across calmly and professionally? Well, if you would, here's 5 points on how to improve your presentation skills. Why would you want to improve your presentation skills? Well, most of our communication generally tends to be with individuals or a couple of people, but now and then we have to get our point across to groups of people. And this is a slightly different skill, especially if you're going to do it at meetings or at seminars, or you've got to do a formal presentation. So it's useful to know a few tips on how to do it better. Number 1, confidence. Now, when they survey people and ask them what their biggest fears are, it's not uncommon for public speaking to come up higher than dying. Yes, that's right. People would rather die than do what I'm doing right now. And I think that's the biggest obstacle to presentation skills, is simply having the nerve to get up and do it, to not be overcome by the fear. So how do you get around that? Well, you've got to build your confidence, but confidence itself is a bit of a tricky subject. There are 2 things you really need to understand about it. Firstly, what is it? If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find the definition is around trust. It's to have trust in something. So when we talk about presentation skills, what we're talking about is to have trust in our own abilities and trust that it will go well. Which brings us to the next question about, if that's what confidence is, where does it come from? Well, there are 3 main things that build your confidence or feed into it. Firstly, knowledge and skills. Being able to do and being prepared to do what you're trying to do will build your confidence. If you don't know how to do something, you're obviously going to be a bit nervous about doing it. So having the knowledge and having the skills you need to do a task, like give a presentation, is important. And we're going to cover a few of the technical aspects in a minute. The second place confidence comes from is from experience. Now, you'll hear the phrase sometimes, practice means perfect, but it's probably more accurate to say perfect practice means perfect. If you practice something and you do it wrong every time, you're not going to get any better at it. So experience is really important, because if we do something and it goes well, we're going to be more confident when we try it again. So it's important we have a go at things in a measured way and we build our confidence through positive experience. A good example of that is if you think of any everyday task that you do all the time and you don't really think about, like tying your shoelaces or making a cup of tea or brushing your teeth. You do these things so many times, there's no doubt in your mind on the outcome. You rarely start to brush your teeth worried about how is this going to go. Because doubt isn't something that enters in your mind, because you've done it thousands of times and it's always gone relatively well. The more you do something and the more it goes well, the bigger your confidence will be. Admittedly, if you do things and they go badly, then the worse your confidence will be. So we've got to find ways we can practice our skills in a positive environment and build them up gently, baby steps. The third aspect of where confidence comes from is attitude, and that simply means the way you think. If you're the kind of person that says, I'm going to be terrible at this is going to go horribly wrong, they call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're almost setting yourself up to fail. Your attitude going into it is one of defeat, if you like. It's much more important that you retain some level of positive mental attitude. And that doesn't mean you have to fool yourself or tell yourself that you're the greatest at anything. You've just got to be honest, but in a positive way. So you tell yourself, okay, I've never done this before, I'm going to try this, I'm probably going to make some mistakes, but that's okay, I'm learning. Mistakes is all part of the learning process. I've just got to get through it. And the next time I do it, it will be easier and it will be better, and so on and so on. Self-talk to yourself as if you were your own best friend. What would they say to you? They would encourage you, they would support you, and you need to do that to yourself. So confidence is something that comes from being prepared, the knowledge and skills. It comes from a positive experience. It means from doing it and it going well. And it means basically having the attitude that you're on a learning curve and just, you'll be fine. Talking to yourself and supporting yourself and encouraging yourself. If you can do those 3 things, your confidence will naturally start to develop the more you do something. Number 2, preparation. If you're going to give a presentation, then it's important that you prepare. And if you're going to prepare one, there's a number of different things you need to consider. Firstly, what is your talk about? I think it's a good idea for you to sit down and really think about what is the focus of what you're talking about. And I like to call it the aim, or even a t-shirt slogan, because I think it should be short, it should be a sentence or two, something you could write on a t-shirt and it makes perfect sense to people. If you can't do that, you run the risk that it's going to be vague and a bit unfocused. So spend a minute or two just saying and working out, maybe write it down, what is my talk about? Once you've done that, you move on to what we call the objectives of your talk, which means the points you're going to cover to achieve your aim. So, and this is where you start to develop the structure of what you're going to talk about. So you don't want too many things depending on how long your talk is. You write down bullet points. So if I'm going to talk about making a cup of tea, then I'm going to talk about the ingredients, the techniques, the recipe, the tools you're going to need. I get a couple of points, bullet points, and I can talk for a minute or two on each of those. So chop that aim up, your t-shirt slogan, what it's about, into the points you've got to cover. Those are your objectives. That brings us to the structure. Now there's lots of fancy structures you can use to actually put your presentation together, but I like to keep things simple, and probably the simplest and easiest structure I've ever heard is what's known as the 3 tell-ems. And it works like this. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. That may sound insane, but let me explain. Firstly, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, which is your introduction. You're going to introduce yourself and you're going to introduce your talk. It doesn't have to be much more than that. If you want to, you could outline the points you're going to cover, which you've already decided on. Then you tell them, which means you cover those points, you talk about and you cover those basic points in your structure, and then you tell them what you told them, which means you summarize, you close. Think of it like the news. At the end they go, the main headlines again. You're going to say, so I talked about this and this and this. You might ask for any questions, you might not, but essentially you then thank the audience, goodbye, that's it. Tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. That's the structure. Now, once you've prepped all that and written it down, etc., it's probably worth considering a few other factors. So you need to consider your audience. Who is this talk to? Do they know a lot about this subject, or do they know nothing about this subject? And adjust your material to suit them. Think about the venue and the size of the audience. Is it a great big stage and hundreds of people, or is it a small room with 5 people, 10 people? Because you might need to change your material to suit that as well. Think about any supplementary material you may need. So are you going to use slides? Are you going to use a flip chart? Are you going to have props or physical things that you need to show people? And how are you going to work those into your subject? Things like that can really bring a presentation to life, but we'll talk about those in a minute or two. And also think about the time. How much time have you got for your talk? Sometimes it's open-ended, but more often than not, someone will tell you you've only got 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour. And you need to work out when you're writing it how long each point's going to last. Now, time's a tricky thing when you do presentations. It's strange. Often when I teach people in a classroom setting and they do presentations, I'll time them. And I don't do that to kind of catch them out. I do that because at the end of their presentations, I'll ask them, how long do you think that took? And it's not unusual for people to say it took twice as long as it actually did, or half as long as it actually did. Depending on how active your brain is, time distorts. It's a weird thing. So if you can get a clock or get your mobile phone with a little timer, that can be really useful. The last thing really to think about are your notes. I tend not to use notes on paper. When I do these videos, I have the notes on a whiteboard like this, which is in front of me, but I try to not to look at it that much. Sorry for the camera bang there. But if you've given a talk, what I would recommend you use are these index cards. Why? Because if you hold a big sheet of paper, the danger is it will, and if you're a bit nervous, you will rattle it. And also if you lose your place on a big sheet of paper, It's hard to find it, but on these little cards, don't write everything. You're not supposed to be reading it. It's supposed to be a reminder. You can just put little bullet points on them. Those little points, okay, I've got to talk about that, then I've got to talk about that. And they're a bit more useful. Also, if you've got several of them, hole punch the corner and put a little treasury tag through. That way if you drop them, nightmare, at least when you pick them up, they'll all still be in the right order. Number 3, delivery. So how do you deliver a good presentation? Well, firstly, take the pressure off yourself. You're not trying to look like a game show host here. You're not trying to be slick. You just want to be natural, a real person. That's what people will engage with. If you're a bit nervous, that's fine. People will understand. Most audiences are pretty forgiving, depending on what you're talking about, obviously. The first thing I would say is plan how you're going to start. What's your opening sentence? Now remember our structure. We said we're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to introduce our talk. So my name is Chris Hughes and today I'm going to talk to you about making a cup of tea. I will cover the following points. Whatever you say, as long as it fits your personality, it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you've kind of got it in your head. I'm going to walk out and I'm going to say that. We want to make a good first impression. So we're going to smile, we're going to look people in the eye, and we're going to try and engage with them. That's our opening. Once you've got past that, then you're off and running. Really all you've got to do then is cover those basic points that you've already planned out in your structure. Probably the only thing I would say to keep in mind is pace, which just means the speed of your presentation. Don't start to slow down. If you lose your place in your notes, it's okay to stop. It will seem to you like it's hours of silence, but to the audience it will seem like seconds. It's not a big deal for you to stop, find out where you are and catch up and get back on track. Okay, and then obviously once you've got through your main points, just have an idea of how you're going to close it. Sometimes we will say any questions. Sometimes it's not a good idea to do that. If you're giving a talk to 500 people and you suddenly say any questions and you've got 2 minutes left and 100 hands go up, it can be tricky to handle that. You don't have to do that, but if you want to and it fits what you're trying to do and the times you've got and the number of people you've got, then go for it. But have an idea how you're going to bring it to a close, even if it's just something as straightforward as, okay, that's the end of my talk. I'd like to thank you for your attention. My name's Chris Hughes. Goodbye. Smile. Leave. Okay, it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to moonwalk off the stage, for instance. In fact, don't do that. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. That's the basics of how you deliver a talk. There's a few other things we need to think about, though, that often come up when I do this. Humour. Should you use humour? Studies have shown that humour is one of the best tools for making people engage with a training session or a presentation. It's really useful. People tend to engage more with the speaker and they tend to remember more as well if it's funny. But the caveat for that is if you can do it. Studies also show that if you can't do it, if you can't tell a joke, it's probably the most destructive thing you can do to any sense of authority you've got. Imagine the nightmare scenario of telling a joke to a room full of people and just hearing the wind gently breezing through the windows, through the trees outside, as people sit there. Maybe a solitary cough. It's horrible, yeah? If in doubt, don't. You don't want to be trivialising what you're talking about. You also got to be careful because what you find really inoffensive and funny, somebody in the audience may find the opposite, quite offensive and funny, or they may find that you're not taking it seriously. So it can be good, but make sure you're really confident you know what you're doing and you've done it before. If you're in any doubt, leave it. Just try and be happy, wryly amusing. Don't try and be a comedian. More often than not, it goes horribly wrong. Microphones you may come across if you're doing presentations. There's not much you need to know about them other than there is a distance between your mouth and the microphone, and the microphone on this is on the camera. So if you can hear, the more I move around, the volume will go up and down. So if you have a lectern with a microphone, just try and stay roughly the same distance from it. Or if you're holding a microphone, don't do this thing with it. Don't pretend you're Tom Jones swinging it around. Okay, just keep it one distance and the levels will stay the same. Okay, Time we've talked about, just keep an eye on the clock because your brain plays funny tricks with you when you're doing presentations about how fast it's going. And the last thing I would say is if something goes wrong, don't worry about it and do not apologize for your talk. Okay, people will forgive you anyway. Just move on. Just acknowledge something went wrong, calm yourself, stop, breathe, think about what you need to do, and then crack on and find your place again and just carry on. Everyone will forget about it. Don't worry about it. Things go wrong. That's life. Don't let it throw you. Number 4, supporting materials. Essentially, this means things other than you talking, things that illustrate what you're saying. So that would include things like videos, slides, flip chart, physical objects, flyers, handouts, anything else that you bring along to illustrate what you're talking about. Now then, there are a lot of things you can do, but the one thing most people tend to fall back on are slides, things like PowerPoint. And that can be a great thing. It can be a great addition to what you're talking about. But there's a couple of points that are worth noting here that I come across quite often. Firstly, if you're going to use any kind of supporting material, it should enhance and add to the main event, which is you talking to the audience. It should not replace that or be the main event. On a couple of occasions, I've seen people where instead of writing what they're going to talk about or planning what they're going to talk about, they start by creating slides. And then before you know it, they're not talking to the audience, they're reading out the slides. And that's not good. The slides should be an addition. It should be one of the last things you prepare. Or the flip chart, whatever. If you're going to use a flip chart, by the way, they tend to be more dynamic. You can get answers from people, you can engage with the audience, and you can expand on an idea. The downside to it is it's messy, and obviously if you've got a huge room with lots of people, they probably can't see it unless you set a camera up on it on a big screen. So be aware of that. Smart boards are another example of that if you want to do something a bit more interactive. But if we talk about slides, there are a couple of things you need to know. Firstly, keep them really simple. Okay, don't overcomplicate them. And text in particular should be kept to a minimum. A word, a couple of bullet points. Really think about how do I reduce the amount of text. Too often I've seen slides where you click to the next slide and there is a full set of paragraphs of text in tiny font that people can barely read. And you can almost hear the audience groaning with, oh blimey, if I've got to read all that. If there's lots of text, it means there's too much and you need to rethink those slides. It's a good idea to not have anything on the font size less than 20. If you find you want to do it less than 20, it's usually because you've got too much text and you're trying to cram it in. If it's less than 20, people will struggle to see it, and it just is a good sign that you've got too much. You need to rethink what your slides got. Also, the font you're going to use and the colour schemes. People with certain conditions like dyslexia can struggle with high contrast slides, things like black text on white, so often it's a good idea to use a colour. I tend to do mine on a blue with a slight colour so there's less contrast. Also certain fonts where they've got serif fonts, they've got curly willy bits on them. Again, people with dyslexia can struggle with those, so I tend to avoid them and go for sans serif fonts, which is French for without the curly whirly bits. So things like Arial or Calibri, they tend to be better. They're more inclusive, we talk about, which means that more people will be able to understand them, which is what we want from all our talks. If you are putting slides together, the other thing is a thing called picture superiority effect. And all that means, it sounds very fancy, is that pictures work better than text. There is an experiment I do occasionally, sometimes it doesn't work, where I'll show people two things. One is an image of something and one is the word describing that something. And the idea is, which do you find drawn to? And more often than not, picture superiority effect says we tend to be drawn to the image rather than the text. So if you are designing slides and you can do something with a photograph or a graphical image or some sort of illustration rather than text, do that. Picture tells 1,000 words. People prefer pictures. They'd much rather engage with that than acres of text. So try and scrap the text if you can. Number 5, adaptations. Now you may have a presentation you've done before, or you may be writing a presentation and in your mind you've got it all mapped out. Occasionally, when we find out about the audience, there are things about the audience which mean our presentation doesn't fit as well as we would like. So sometimes we have to make adaptations to our talk to suit the audience it is being delivered to. Now these can be to do with certain impairments. So if someone, for instance, or you know that people in your audience, especially if it's a small group, have a visual impairment, some sort of visual issue, maybe even blindness, there are things you can do to get around that. Obviously, if you're very slide heavy, then you've got some issues there. You may need to consider changing that approach. If it's just a slight impairment, you may be able to get around that by having handouts of the slides, if you're going to use slides, or don't use slides, or change the seating arrangement. Have people sit close to the stage so they can see the projector, the screens easier. If they've got an auditory, the hearing issue, then you may choose a venue or choose a room that has a hearing loop, or again you may seat them closer to the stage, or you may give them a transcript or your notes or a handout to support the talk so they can read along or they can see the slides as they're going along. But if we know these things, it's a good idea for you to try and adapt your presentation to suit, because what we want is we want to engage with our audience, and if our audience is struggling to understand us, there's an obstacle and we want to get around that as best we can. We've already mentioned another adaptation maybe about the level of understanding in your audience. If your audience knows nothing about what you're talking about, you may need to bring the level down a bit. It's more introductory. But if they know a lot about it, then you may need to up it a bit and get into the detail, get into the more sophisticated elements of what you're talking about. If you get that level wrong and it's too high for your audience, they can be, you know, there's that expression where it goes right over their heads. They don't understand what you're talking about. But if you get it too low for your audience, then they can feel like it's boring. They know this stuff. It's obvious. You're not giving them any new information. So if you do know a little bit about the audience, it's worth considering adapting your presentation to suit. That's what good speakers do. So there you have it. We've talked about building your confidence. We've talked about preparation, the delivery, supporting materials, and adaptations. But probably the key thing you need to do to develop your skills in this area is you've got to have a go. You can't just develop this by watching a video. It's a practical skill, so you've got to do it. So look for opportunities where you can build your confidence by having a go. Now, I know for some people that fills them with terror. So what I would say to you is make it as easy as possible. Pick a nice group of people. Pick one person, if that's what you can deal with to begin with. Design a little talk. When we do it in the classroom, it's literally 5 minutes about anything you want. It's not what you're talking about at this stage that's important. It's the act of getting up and doing it. So pick yourself a subject, write out some bullet points. Making a cup of tea is fine, and just sit somebody down and do your talk to them. Once you've done it the first time, you can do it 100 times. And if you can do it to one person or 3 people, you can do it to 100 people. You've just got to work up to that. Think about baby steps. But remember our 3 elements of confidence: skills and knowledge, attitude. But the key thing you need here is positive experience. So you need to do it. You need to get on the horse and start riding. Okay, so what I would encourage you to do now is take note of all the things we've talked about, but look for some way, if you can do it at work or in a voluntary organisation or some meeting or something, look for some opportunity that you can have a go. Do it. Most people, if they understand you're nervous and they understand you're new to this, will be forgiving, they will be supportive, you might even enjoy it. Okay, have a go. Best of luck. I hope that has been of use to you. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.